We're going to start our deep dive into Ted Tripp's very popular Christian parenting book, Shepherding a Child's Heart. We're going to be looking at the themes and going chapter by chapter. But first, I want to take a look at a little bit of a biography of Ted Tripp, primarily focusing on things that would be related to this work, so we can try and understand his worldview. Ted was born in the late 40s. He got married in the late 60s to his wife, Margie. They went on to have 3 children that were born kind of late 60s, early 70s. Ted had several vocational paths. So he was a pastor for decades, many years. Probably his primary vocation was a pastor of a church named Grace Fellowship in Hazleton, Pennsylvania. This is a Reformed Baptist church. That's where he pastored for decades. There's still some of his sermons online. So that would have been his main vocational work. He also was a teacher, principal, and administrator at a school he and Margie began named Emmanuel Christian. He also was a counselor for the Christian Counseling and Education Foundation. Put a pin in that. That will be relevant to what we talk about later on. So this would have kind of shaped his ministry context as well as some of his educational or theological background. He got his bachelor's from Geneva College in history. He went on to get his master's of divinity from the Reformed Episcopal Seminary, and then eventually his doctor of ministry from Westminster, where, according to his personal LinkedIn, it was focused in pastoral studies and counseling. As best I can tell, he kind of was began undergrad in 72, according to his personal LinkedIn, and then was finished with his doctorate in 1988. In Shepherding a Child's Heart, he talks about doing his doctoral studies while he had teenagers in the home. So somewhere in there, he was doing all of this coursework while he was parenting, while he was pastoring, and possibly while he was a counselor. He doesn't give dates for when he was this counselor in biblical counseling, and while he was a teacher somewhat. And you'll see in Shepherding a Child's Heart, he references anecdotes from a school, from teachers getting involved. So I think it's fair to say that was an influence in his book as well. I think it's worth noting that, at least according to what's public information, he did not have a background in education or child development or anything of that nature. So even though he was involved in this Christian school, Christian schools are not required to have the same kind of accreditation that maybe a public school would. So he did, to my knowledge, what's publicly available, he did not pursue a teaching degree or certification. I'm going to make a pretty strong case that his primary worldview was formed by the basic ideas of biblical and nouthetic counseling. Why? Well, a lot of it has to do with not just that his doctorate was in that. I mean, his doctoral studies were in that at Westminster, and Westminster was known for having that program. J. Adams, who started nouthetic counseling, came to Westminster. We'll get to his bio a little bit because there's a lot of overlap. He started a doctoral program, I think in homiletics at Westminster. He probably was teaching overlapping when Ted would have been a student there for sure. And for many years, Westminster was more clearly nouthetic. In recent years, they, along with other biblical counseling programs, tried to bring some nuance, some different identities, and there was some fracturing. But at the time when Ted was involved in these studies, this would have kind of all been happening. It was still very much in development. So what do we know about J. Adams? He was an older generation, a generation up from Ted. He was born in 29. What was interesting as I was digging on him, he graduated high school at 15 and went straight to seminary. So the Reformed Episcopal Seminary, same seminary Ted Tripp went to, admitted him at age 15. And I'm not sure if he simultaneously went to seminary and undergrad at Johns Hopkins, but he graduated in 1952 with both of his degrees at once. So he got his bachelor's in divinity from the Reformed Episcopal Seminary and his bachelor's in classics from Johns Hopkins this same year. At some point, he later went on to get a master's in sacred theology and a PhD in speech. Why do I mention this? Well, I think especially when you start talking about pastors and spiritual authority figures who claim the title doctor, and they've done doctoral work, which is an accomplishment on its own. I don't want to minimize that. But a lot of times you'll just see Dr. Adams without maybe the disclaimer, his doctoral work was in speech. So that makes him a very competent speaker, I imagine. But that's not really related to his work in biblical studies or counseling. What's interesting about Ted is the only place I could find naming what his doctoral work was in was on his LinkedIn profile. I contacted Westminster and they wouldn't release that information, and it's just not in his bio, which I think is really interesting given how in recent years nouthetic and biblical counseling has come under scrutiny. Lots more could be said about Adams' biography, but we won't do that here. I just want to note that in 1963 he was invited to teach homiletics at Westminster, and part of it, he was assigned this class in pastoral theology called poemics at the time that nobody wanted to teach. And this is all, by the way, coming from the Institute of Nouthetic Counseling's website, their extensive biography on J. Adams. So he was assigned this class to teach. He had no training in it. He self-studied and he taught it. And this is when he began to explore the ideas of biblical counseling. And this is when he began to explore the ideas of biblical counseling. And he was trying to also study modern psychology. And in his first book, Competent to Counsel, he really gets into this. He was trying to study the different branches of contemporary psychology, and he was not able to make it fit with his understanding of a biblical worldview. And at the time, he also shadowed a man who had been the head of the American Psychological Association for many years, who was an atheist, who kind of was very critical of the field of psychology and saying it's not helpful to overly psychologize events in people's life. Let's have them take responsibility for what's going on in their life. And Adams really admired that. And so he kind of took that, if you want to call it deconstruction of psychology, the field of psychology, and said, let's take that perspective and let's replace it and give people instead a way to take responsibility through these biblical ideas. And this began to develop into his thought. In 1968, he started the Christian Counseling and Education Foundation, which Ted Tripp was a counselor at. Also, Ted Tripp would have studied under him in some fashion or been influenced by him when he was at Westminster. I use the term nouthetic because I think it's more precise and gets at these roots. A lot of people have tried to distance from that because Adams came under a lot of criticism. When he wrote his book that eventually became Competent to Counsel, he sent a draft around to other professors of pastoral theology, and they said it was too sharp, it was too pointed, it was too harsh. And he listened to that feedback and elevated his sharpness because he thought, this is again from that bio on the foundation he started, Institute of Nouthetic Studies. He thought, well, they're not using their platform to change anything. They all agreed with his critique of secular psychology, that his starting point that pastors needed something different, but they weren't doing anything. So he kind of amped that up. But also a lot of people latched onto it. The timelines really overlap here. So Ted Tripp would have been influenced by the thinking of J. Adams. He was studying in that field. He was counseling in Adams' counseling organization. It is no wonder that when he gets to his acknowledgments, he thanks J. Adams as well as David Powlison, who also is a key player when nouthetic and biblical counseling was developing. He kind of is someone who bridges the gap between a lot of the branches that went in different directions. And Powlison went on in his doctoral program, I don't know what it was in, I couldn't find it. He wrote a dissertation that analyzed the history of the biblical counseling movement from an insider's perspective. So these people were friends and co-laborers. They probably shared a lot of similar perspectives and certainly were mutually influencing one another. I also want to note that 1970s when Adams' book Competent to Counsel came out, and 1970s also when James Dobson's Dare to Discipline came out. So these ideas were hitting the evangelical imagination at around the same time. Ted Tripp would have been a young man and a young father.